Rudy Giuliani says he will not comply with today's deadline to comply with congressional subpoenas. On Twitter, Giuliani called the inquiry illegitimate, unconstitutional, and baseless, and said at this time he no longer needs a lawyer. House Democrats demanded Giuliani turn over documents related to his attempts to get Ukrainian officials to investigate Joe Biden. Let's bring in Anita Kumar and Sarah Wire. Anita is a White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico. She's in Arlington, Virginia. Sarah is a congressional reporter for the Los Angeles Times. She is on Capitol Hill. Welcome to both of you. All right, Sarah, let me begin with you. Now that Rudy Giuliani will not comply with the subpoena, what steps do you expect House Democrats to take?
Now, that's going to be really interesting to watch because Giuliani isn't a member of the government. He's not a federal employee. He doesn't work for the administration directly. And so he can't have a claim of executive privilege, and the White House can't technically order him not to comply. They have the chance of pursuing this through court, Holton and contempt of Congress, but we're not quite sure yet how they're going to respond.
So, Anita, in her testimony yesterday, Fiona Hill said former National Security Advisor John Bolton called the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, a, quote, hand grenade. Is the White House worried about what would happen if Giuliani does have to testify or turn over those documents?
Yeah, I think the situation today with Rudy Giuliani wasn't surprising because the White House has directed everyone to go that route, right? They don't want anyone to participate. They don't want anyone to provide documents. They don't want anyone to be a witness. But yes, I mean, all sort of roads are leading to Rudy Giuliani. So I'm sure that they don't want him to testify for a couple reasons. One is he is sort of in the middle of everything here. He has been working on this Ukraine situation for months now, months longer than a lot of people realize, sort of behind the scenes since last year. But the other thing is Giuliani tends to get agitated. We've seen him on TV where he sometimes contradicts himself, has confusing remarks, and there are a lot of people that are close to President Trump that do not feel like he's a good advocate for him out there on television. So it's partly he would probably be the same way in front of a congressional committee.
Well, Sarah, what about Bolton? Do Democrats plan to subpoena him?
We haven't heard that directly yet. It could come up. This morning, Representative Jim Jordan said directly that Republicans would have questions for Mr. Bolton, but we haven't seen a subpoena. We haven't seen a request for a deposition yet. I imagine that he would be called at some point based on some of these conversations and the timeline for how he left the administration.
Right, absolutely. Well, Anita, how concerned is the White House about what John Bolton could tell the committees?
Well, but considering the president and John Bolton left parted ways and not very well, right? If you remember,
the tweet
a few
storm.
Weeks ago, was that
the
when
Twitter
was that?
war.
Weeks or a few months ago? Yeah, right. So they both had a difference of opinion on how he left. Was he fired? Did he leave on his own volition? When he gave a resignation, all that. And I think that can all come back to play. John Bolton has spoken a few times, with reporters since he's left, and he's said it like it is. I mean, he just has said whatever he's wanted. And so I think that they think if he goes out and talks, it would not be good. And right. So he, judging by the testimony from yesterday, it seemed that he was very upset at what was going on and would have very strong feelings about that and would share that information.
Right. Well, Sarah, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff gave his thoughts on the topic of transparency and the impeachment inquiry yesterday. Let's listen to some of that.
I do think that it is important to conduct as much as we can when we can in open session. Of course, all these transcripts are going to be made public.
In what period?
Well, I don't want to give myself a date, but we want to make sure that we lock down the testimony of people before they can see what others have said, before it influences their own testimony.
So, Sarah, this topic of transparency is an interesting one. How big of a priority, first of all, is transparency for House Democrats? And are Republicans perhaps demanding more of it?
And this is an issue we're hearing a lot about from Republicans. Every time they've come out of the depositions this week, that's been their main point of discussion, is that this hasn't been handled fairly, it's not being handled in a transparent manner. They've talked about making sure the transcripts become public and that every member of Congress should be able to be part of these hearings. Speaker Pelosi addressed this directly a little bit earlier today, saying that she supported Adam Schiff in holding these hearings in a closed fashion because they don't want the witnesses to be able to corroborate the details in public. At the same time, we've seen this over and over in other situations where members don't always ask the most probing questions in a public hearing, and they don't always get the most detailed answers. And so sometimes that privacy can lead to more information, and I think that's what Schiff and Pelosi are really hoping for.
Sarah, let me ask you, what information were Democrats hoping to get out of George Kent today?
Well, his position with the administration, I think, could really drive. He was part of some of the closed-door conversations that directly relate to Ukraine and to what the State Department knew and what role they played.
I want to turn to Syria and the president's decision to pull troops out of northern Syria. Anita, yesterday we learned that the president is sanctioning Turkey because of its incursion into Syria. The president is also sending Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice President Mike Pence to Turkey as part of a delegation to seek a peace deal. Does the administration believe these measures will actually change Turkey's stance?
Well, it's a little unclear. I mean, President Trump has said over and over again that he feels like sanctions, he could impose sanctions that would really make a difference. You saw members of Congress saying that the sanctions don't go nearly far enough and they won't make a difference, and they want to actually have a bigger sanctions package. So it's a little bit unclear. I do think that Mike Pence is going there to make sure to reiterate that the president is not supporting this effort of Turkey going into Syria. He didn't, if you'll recall, it was only a few days ago where the president made this announcement. He didn't actually say that. He didn't actually say, we don't support Turkey going into Syria. So there were a lot of people who thought this is exactly what the president wants. This is, people are getting killed and they're blaming him. So I think that he really wants to send a strong signal that that is not what he wants. That's not what he wanted to happen. And I think he really needs to convince some people of that, because there are people that are very skeptical of that right now.
Meantime, Sarah, the Senate brought Reverend Andrew Brunson to deliver today's opening prayer. And Brunson, people will recall, was imprisoned for 2 years in Turkey before President Trump secured his release in 2018. Well, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell issued this rebuke earlier today. Let's listen to that.
This violence needs to end. Syrian Kurdish forces have stood proudly alongside U.S. forces in the fight against ISIS. Over years of joint effort, their shared sacrifices have put ISIS on its heels and rendered its physical caliphate essentially non-existent. The United States has taken the fight to Syria and Afghanistan because that is where our enemies are. That's why we're there. Fighting terrorists, exercising leadership in troubled regions, and advancing U.S. interests around the world does not make us an evil empire or the world's policeman. It makes us a prudent and responsible world power that stands up for our own security and the freedom of others.
So, Sarah, as you well know, this is not the first time Republican lawmakers have disagreed publicly with the president on something. However, I'm wondering if this particular disagreement, from your experience and based on what you have seen reporting there on Capitol Hill, appears to be different at all in terms of the depth of opposition to the president's decision regarding Syria.
In a lot of ways, it does seem different. Some of the people who are being the most vocal right now are some of the president's strongest allies. I'm looking specifically at Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell. And so it is interesting to see them rebuke the president, though if you notice, they're very careful not to mention the president's name, not to make it about him. The country's kind of in a difficult position on this because there's only so much that sanctions actually do. And at the same time, you're sanctioning a NATO ally. And so I know the Republicans and the Democrats are both saying that they want to move forward on this quickly, but it's going to be really fascinating to watch how far they go and how much of a difference it actually makes in the long run.
Anita, I'm wondering about the president's circle of advisors at this point, particularly on this issue of Syria. Do we know who those voices are that perhaps might be most influential around the president regarding this? Is there anyone, for instance, who may be in a position to offer an opposing view and still have that be heard and considered by President Trump?
A lot of those people, as you know, have already left the administration, not just on foreign policy issues, but just on any, all issues. Those people that pushed back on him, and I would say John Bolton, his former national security advisor, was one of those people on foreign policy, but there were others, his former attorney, former counselor Don McGahn, Gary Cohn. So different people, a lot of those people have left. President Trump has in the White House a lot of people that he feels like are on his side that people say don't push back as much. So, it's a little bit unclear what that looks like when he says he wants to do something. What I am hearing, though, is that he often doesn't consult people. So if he had consulted people or more people, especially national security people, in the Department of Defense, they would tell him this is not the right thing to do, and sometimes they're just not aware of what's going on. But politically, I am hearing from a lot of people across the country that say that his supporters really, really do like this, that the United States is pulling out. And so he might be listening to that a little bit more than he's listening to people in the White House.
Interesting. Well, Sarah, is there any action congressional Democrats can take to block the president's maneuvers in Syria?
You have to keep in mind that the Senate is controlled by Republicans, so House Democrats can do whatever they want. They can pass bills and resolutions and censure, but if Republicans in the Senate aren't on board, it's not going anywhere.
Right. All right. A lot to watch here in the weeks ahead. Anita Kumar and Sarah Wire, thank you both very much.